When femininity is gone, what is the remains of the day? Hello everyone, I'm Sarah from Everyday Starlet. Welcome to my channel. I make videos to inspire you to be the star of your own life. I'm continuing my masculine and feminine energies film breakdown series with Remains of the Day. This film was a request by my good friend Dominic Izzo. I've been a frequent guest on his podcast, so I'm going to leave those episodes below so you can check those out. We talk about film stuff, relationship dynamics, all kinds of stuff like that. So if you enjoy my content, I think you'd really love listening to our episodes. So I will link those below. Be sure you check those out. If you're not familiar with what I mean by masculine and feminine energies, I talk about this in most of my videos, but a brief summary. Masculine and feminine energies are energies that live within all of us. We all contain both energies, but we all have a core energy. This is the one we're most ourselves in. That energy often links up with our gender. It doesn't have to, but it very often does. We can be in wounded or healed versions of either of these energies, and all these energies contain archetypes, and we all embody all the archetypes we can tap into whenever we need to. And in order to have sexual polarity in a relationship, you need one partner to be in the masculine energy and one partner to be in the feminine energy, because opposite energies attract sexually and same energies repel sexually. So let's look at Remains of the Day. Remains of the Day is a film from 1993, but it mostly took place in the 1930s. It is essentially the story of a butler, Mr. Stevens, played by Anthony Hopkins, and it sort of tells his story of his service to his lord and the home. So a little bit of it is like 20 years into the future, and a little bit of it is from the 1930s, and you're kind of going back and forth in those two different time periods. So this film overall is a really great example of what a world would be like if we just took out feminine energy. This whole world that this film takes place in is very devoid of natural feminine energy. There's basically this mansion, there's a lord in the mansion, and he has the service staff, and Mr. Stevens is his butler who runs all of the other servants in the staff. Now, masculine energy is very structured, it's very disciplined, it can feel very cold when it's devoid of any feminine energy. It tends to lack empathy. It tends to put having a passion, a purpose, a mission, a direction above connection and relationships, love, that kind of thing. And pretty much this whole world is just that. It is structure, it is direction, it is having a certain purpose, and that is what you're going to do, and that's that. It's about this butler who has dedicated his life to service and to be in service. And one aspect of masculine energy that I don't think that we discuss as much is we think of masculine energy as being the leaders, and it is very much about leadership, which Mr. Stevens does, but every leader answers to a higher leader. So he is a butler and he is in service to his lord, which you could very much symbolize that no matter how high up you get in service, most masculine beings end up, and this is not a religious thing, but most masculine beings end up in service to some kind of divine power. You can call it God or whatever your religious background is. So the fact that Mr. Stevens was in service to his lord, that might have been a play on words. I don't know if that was intentional, but just because the masculine in a relationship is typically the leader, he usually has people he's leading who could be masculine beings or feminine beings, but he's usually in service to a greater masculine being in this situation. You don't have to be the supreme all be all leader of like an entire organization in order to be in your masculine and to be a masculine leader. It's anytime that you are taking the lead and guiding the people who you are responsible for guiding, whether that be your family, whether that be a work situation. So I think oftentimes, at least even when I talk about masculine leadership, there is this idea that the masculine always leads the feminine, and that's not necessarily true. The masculine can lead other masculine beings. He can be led by another masculine being. So it's not necessarily just a masculine feminine role situation. In this situation, Mr. Stevens is a very masculine character. He's a lot of direction. He has a lot of purpose, discipline, structure. His whole surroundings are all very disciplined. You meet Mr. Stevens' father, who basically is essentially in service to his direction, his purpose. He's a butler. He's always been a butler. They hire him on as the under butler, whatever that term means. I guess he works just directly under the butler, I guess is the deal. I don't really know that much about British high society, but his father is literally doing this service until the day he dies. And Mr. Stevens has really put having any kind of relationships, definitely romantic, but really having any kind of emotional connection or relationships at all aside for this purpose. He is a butler. That is his purpose in life. And I know this is a controversial thing that I talk about the idea that when men fully step into their masculine energy, they don't want to run around with a lot of different women. Running around with a lot of different women is the opposite of masculine energy. It's usually some wounding in a man's feminine energy. It's usually him trying to avoid something, run away from something. And that when most men step into the fullness of their masculine energy, they want to settle down with one specific feminine woman, because anything else is a distraction, and he wants to pick a feminine woman that is there to support him in his highest purpose. Many cultures believe that when a man fully steps into his masculine, like if he just really like all the way steps into the absolute fullness of his masculine energy, he would essentially become a monk. Or not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily have to be a monk per se, but Mr. Stevens really is that. I mean, in a sense, he is devoid of any feminine energy around him. He's devoid of any kind of other connections because he is solely in service to his purpose, which he believes is to be a butler. It's his sole purpose in life, according to him. When many men get to that extreme, and most people in life are not going to get to that extreme. I'm not saying that somebody is not masculine if they don't step into that extreme. But in this case, Mr. Stevens is so far into his masculine energy and is so far into his masculine purpose. And it's referred to several times in the film, which we'll get to a little bit later, that he doesn't want any distractions. Any feminine energy around him is just a distraction, and he just avoids that completely, which is usually a sign that somebody is just solely dedicated to their purpose, that they don't want any feminine energy around them. The lack of feminine energy in this film reminds me a little bit of, the films are very different, but it reminds me a bit of Chocolat, which I did a breakdown of, which was a little bit more of a fun, playful film. Like Remains of the Day is a little bit more melancholy, so to speak. But it's that energy of when you have a community that is so structured and so disciplined, it tends to be kind of dark, very drab, very flavorless, colorless. Like it is a very drab world that they're living in. Everything is very serious, it's very structured, it's very disciplined. Even to the point where the Lord of the Mansion has a godson played by a young Hugh Grant, who is just adorable. I just love Hugh Grant because he's just adorable in like every role he plays. He's basically the Lord's godson, and he's kind of coming of age, so to speak, and the Lord is kind of awkwardly asking the butler to essentially have the talk about the birds and the bees, which they keep referring to as like the birds and the bees, and like nobody will actually even say sex, which sexual energy is feminine energy, so like they're literally devoid of sexual energy as well. So nobody will actually say sex, and then the interaction with Mr. Stevens and the Lord's godson is just like, I mean, they're talking about nature, which nature is very feminine as well, but they're really trying to talk about sex, but it's not really computing, like it's not really going through. I mean, Hugh Grant is just funny regardless of what he does, but it's a humorous scene where it's just sort of like these two men who are kind of like awkwardly talking about something, but they don't really know what the other one is talking about, and you can kind of tell that neither one of them really have any idea what they're talking about when it comes to nature or sex. So that is so significant of the fact that this whole world is just like devoid of feminine energy, and that happens a lot in communities that reject it. And I think we're going through a lot of that now. We've really taken feminine energy out of our society so much right now. We have kind of like some fake facades of what's feminine, but we've really tried to destroy a lot of like the natural feminine energy. We devalue the natural feminine gifts that women bring to relationships. I see it all the time on social media of dealing with men who have no clue. Like they want a traditional woman, but they have no clue what that means because they've so devalued what women bring to a relationship. That's one of the reasons why I really believe that I see this meme all the time that talks about, you know, masculinity is so important, which is why they tried to destroy it first. And I think that's false in a sense that, yes, masculinity is incredibly, incredibly important, but they didn't try to destroy it first. They've been trying to destroy femininity for decades now. And because it's easier, right? Women tend to be the ones who surrender, the ones who are led in a situation. If you take women and you manipulate them into believing that they have to be more masculine or more like men, then you end up with women who are more manly. It weakens men because of sexual polarity. Men and women are not going to get together in that situation because you're going to have two masculine energies coming together and they're not really gonna bond sexually. So men then become weaker, and they've been slowly weakening men over time by slowly giving women this false sense of power so that men then became weaker, and now they're coming in and trying to destroy masculinity with the whole concept of toxic masculinity and all that stuff. That's a whole other topic we could delve into a lot deeper. I don't want to make that the focus of this video, but we really tried to destroy feminine energy for a long time, and like this world that we've created is very much what's going to happen if you completely destroy femininity. Yes, people are going to be disciplined servants, but it's going to be very drab. It's going to be very colorless. It's going to be very kind of boring if you think about it. So enter Miss Kenton, played by Emma Thompson. Miss Kenton is hired as the housekeeper, and she is very much a feminine being. She very much values relationships, community. She shows emotion. She has emotions. She values beauty and sensuality and things like that, which is not something that this mansion has been used to, and it's definitely not something Mr. Stevens has been used to. He actually, it's referenced that he goes out of his way to avoid hiring attractive women because it's like he doesn't want the distraction. And Miss Kenton and Mr. Stevens' interactions are very subtle. Like their relationship and the way that it builds is all very subtle. It's not overt at all. When Mr. Stevens' father passes away, it's Miss Kenton who's actually with his father when it happens. She's the one showing emotions. Mr. Stevens doesn't show emotions. He's like, my father would want me to get back to my work. He goes back to his work. He stays in that discipline. He doesn't let emotions come up. And it's interesting because several times in the film when Mr. Stevens is going through emotions, and it's very subtle, like he doesn't let anyone see him go through emotions, but other people will start to notice, like, and ask him if he's unwell. That's actually very common when you're dealing with a masculine being who has no sense of connecting his emotions and really can't move through his emotions or doesn't have ways to express his emotions. He'll usually seem off, but you won't know why he's off. Like, he'll try not to let you know that things are off. Typically, feminine beings are really good at sensing that. They can tell when a masculine being is off because women tend to be much more intuitive in that sense. But even the men in this film, like Mr. Stevens is so masculine that when he is in emotions, even when he's suppressing them, they always think like, are you unwell? Like it always goes to that. Like after his father passes away, when Miss Kenton leaves later on in the film, like anytime that he is going through emotions but he's holding them back, he thinks he does such a good job of holding them back. And it's not obvious, but people are just sort of like, there's something a little off here. Are you unwell? And that's a real sign that he is obviously not able to connect to any part of his own inner feminine energy in order to actually let those emotions come through. When Mr. Kenton hires a female, he always points out that she can't have any gentleman callers in the house. And it's kind of implied that he doesn't want any of his female employees, or male employees really, to have any kind of relations, because again, that sexual energy, that connection and that companionship, that's all feminine energy, and they're really trying to, without really knowing it, they're trying to completely eliminate feminine energy really from their life. Miss Kenton loves to go out and pick flowers in the garden, and she puts a little bouquet of flowers in Mr. Stevens' office, and you know, he's basically like, you know, no, this is my sanctuary. Masculine beings tend to need a sanctuary. It goes beyond like the man cave thing, but it's like they usually like to have some kind of place where they can be in silence and stillness. And the idea that like something like flowers, which flowers are very feminine. Flowers represent the feminine. They're always opening and closing. Their existence is really for beauty and for sensuality. Like flowers are very much representative of feminine energy. And the fact that he doesn't even want flowers in his office, like he doesn't want that feminine energy because it's a distraction. And of course, like Miss Kenton is sort of like, flowers are a distraction. Like in that point, she hasn't realized how much he is blocking out any kind of feminine energy. She's starting to realize it, but she doesn't realize that he really is human and does really want that connection, but he's blocking that out because he believes it's a distraction. Now this is the time when, you know, like Nazi Germany and all that kind of stuff, and that's kind of like a running theme that goes throughout the film. And at one point, the Lord insists that they have to fire 2 of the like housemaids because they're Jewish. Controversial time at that point. Miss Kenton is so concerned, like, oh my God, these girls are gonna get sent back to Germany. They're not gonna be safe. Like she's more worried about their safety, whereas Mr. Stevens is like, nope, this was the order, I'm following orders. Very military mindset, which tends to be very, very masculine. If you think about, if you really want to think about masculine energy about protecting and providing. If you think about the careers that are the most masculine, things like police, military, things like that, what do? Protect and serve. That's masculine energy right there. So the masculine is a lot more likely to follow a direct order, so to speak, because that's sort of that military mindset, that kind of like, all right, I need to follow this order because that's my purpose and that's my direction. Whereas the feminine is much more likely to think about the person, the humanity, the relationships, people's well-being, have a lot more empathy for people. That's just the reality. And that's the feminine in all of us. So I'm not saying that a masculine being can't have compassion, empathy, things like that. In this particular situation, you have you have some really extremes as far as a masculine being who has just taken all the feminine energy out of his life completely. So he doesn't necessarily understand the consequences of what's going to happen to these girls, because he's just thinking of, okay, I'm told this is what I have to do and this is my purpose. My purpose is to serve, so this is what I have to do. I mean, it does kind of fall a little bit in line with that whole idea of like, I was just following orders, you know, like that kind of thing, which is kind of controversial. But again, his job and his purpose is to follow an order, even if he does have a drive to care about protecting the young girls, which you do find out a little bit later that he does want these girls to be okay. He doesn't want them to not be well, and he just had a higher purpose that he had to answer to, and so his purpose had to come first because of his masculine mindset. Whereas in the feminine mindset, it's not that they can't have a purpose, but they're gonna value relationships, humanity, loving connection over their purpose. There's a scene where Miss Kenton finds Mr. Stevens with a book, and she's kind of teasing him. It's very subtle, but it's like, is it a racy book? And he's kind of being very reserved. She's kind of seducing him. It's super subtle, but she's kind of almost like trying to build up that sexual energy, because the feminine is very much about sexual energy, and his extreme masculine and her extreme feminine are going to be attracted to each other. That's just the nature of polarity. So she's becoming very attracted to him, becoming attracted to his structure, his discipline. Even though it frustrates her at times, that frustration can very often cultivate sexual chemistry. So she's becoming more attracted to him. So she's kind of trying to stir up some of that sexual energy. I mean, it is very subtle throughout the entire interactions between the two of them. But again, he's really trying to be very devoid of that sexual energy. And you find out he's reading a romance novel, and he tries to play it off as like, I'm just trying to educate myself. I'm trying to get more command of the English language. Like, again, it's like he can't do this for pleasure. Like, there's no pleasure in his life. Pleasure is feminine. Pleasure is feminine energy. So he's trying to justify any enjoyment or any pleasure by having a greater purpose. Whereas for the feminine, pleasure is its own purpose. Whereas the masculine may often need a reason to engage in something pleasurable when he's in his masculine energy. The feminine will enjoy pleasure for the sake of enjoying pleasure. So there's that extreme interaction. She's becoming more attracted to him. She's trying to cultivate some sexual energy, and he's still so structured and so dedicated that he just can't waver from that. He can't actually allow himself to step into any pleasure, to actually start connecting to somebody, because he's got that whole part of himself completely blocked off. So Miss Kenton gets an offer to get married, and she decides to accept it. We find out later she accepted it because she was really hoping that Mr. Stevens would stop her, would try to, like she said, she wanted to get like a ruse out of him. Like, she was trying to get him stirred up in some way, like just get him to feel something, to express something in himself. Like, she wanted something from him. The feminine's plea, like, I'm gonna pretend I'm gonna leave, and I hope he doesn't call my bluff, because she wants something out of him. She's testing him, really. I mean, it's feminine testing. It's like, okay, I'm gonna leave, I've got this offer, I'm gonna go, because she wants him to finally admit his feelings for her. He pretends it doesn't bother him, but if you notice, like, he smiles in that scene. Really, it's one of the few times in the entire movie that he actually smiles. Kenton confesses to Mr. Stevens that she talks to, you know, her fiance essentially about Mr. Stevens, and, you know, like the way he pinches his nose with his pepper and things like, it's like she's acknowledging that she notices those little things about him. She actually feels something for him. It's her way of kind of admitting to him that she's feeling something for him, because she notices all these little things. He's a butler, he's a servant. He's really not supposed to be noticed. He's supposed to kind of go under the radar and just be of service and run things. She's basically confessing to him that she sees him, she witnesses him, and she really cares about him, and she notices those things. And that makes him very uncomfortable, but he smiles. Like, he smiles in that interaction and then kind of leaves the situation. And then he ends up finding Miss Kenton in her room, and she's crying and sobbing, and because she wanted him to admit his feelings. She wanted to feel that love and connection from him. She didn't really want that from her fiance. She wanted that from Mr. Stevens. So she goes into her room, and Mr. Stevens walks in, and that's the moment, like, she thinks that he's going to confess his love, that he's going to open up, and he basically just tells her about another chore that needs to be done. You know, as she's crying and sobbing, again, like, she's in her emotions, she's in her feminine emotions, and he's still, like, in that purpose. It's like he's kind of almost telling her, this is the only way I know to be. This purpose, this life is all I know. And, like, him showing up and witnessing her in this, but then kind of giving her a job to do, that's all he knows. That's the most he can give her. Fast forward 20 years later, and you find out that Miss Kenton has been married. She's back and forth with her husband. They're on again, they're off again, this and that. She has a daughter, and she writes Mr. Stevens a letter because she finds out that the Lord of the Manor has passed on, and there's going to be a new owner, and he's going to have a new boss. So Mr. Stevens decides to take a trip to visit Miss Kenton. And I mean, he doesn't really take days off. He doesn't take time off, but this is his, I mean, him taking time off to go see her is huge. I mean, for somebody like him who is so dedicated to his purpose, to just literally go off and see her and reconnect with her is huge for somebody like this. For someone with that much masculine purpose and direction, to take time away to go see a feminine being is like, it's big. It's something I don't think enough women understand, that like if you are dealing with a very masculine man, anytime he takes away from his passion and purpose, from his purpose, his work, if that is his purpose, to be with you, even if it's just a little time, that's huge. That is a huge compliment if he's choosing to use that time to see you, because for most masculine beings, taking any time away from their passion and purpose is a big deal. So if he's choosing to use that time with you, it's a huge compliment. So the fact that Mr. Stevens takes this time to actually travel to go see her is huge. And there is some talk that she might come back and work as a housekeeper again with the new owner. I get the feeling that Mr. Stevens really wants her to do that because he wants her around, he wants her in his life, but he doesn't know how to be anything else or do anything else. So she really has to come to him, which is usually what happens if you're dealing with masculine feminine dynamics. The feminine usually has to go to the masculine, like where his job goes, where his direction goes, that's usually where they're gonna need to be. But then she finds out that her daughter's about to have a baby and her husband wants her back, and I don't remember what her married name was in this film, but Miss Kenton basically makes the last minute decision that she really needs to be close to her family. She wants to be close to her grandchild, and when Mr. Stevens gets there, she essentially tells him that she really can't. She can't go back to work, and she can't go back to the manor with him. They have this really beautiful moment on the pier, and she basically confesses to him that she really just said she was getting married because she wanted to get, you know, a rouse out of him. She wanted to stir things up with him, and she was actually really shocked when she realized that she was married, and she was unhappy, but then she had her daughter. And that's one of the things about the feminine, is very often the feminine will develop feelings for people over time. And I mentioned this actually in my Out of Africa review, is even if you get into a marriage or a relationship that the feminine doesn't really love, and it might not even be with someone she truly loves, over time, that connection, that sharing a life with someone, sharing a child with someone, there's a lot of talk about soul ties and things like that. When you actually have a child with somebody, there's like a bond there. The feminine will develop love. There is this idea that the feminine needs to instantly be attracted to somebody in order to feel love for them. That's actually not true. The feminine's love will very often grow over time the more she actually spends with someone and connects with somebody. Her time with Mr. Stevens is evidence of that. They kind of weren't really on the same page at first. You know, they were a little bit closed off to each other in the beginning, but that love started to develop over time. And I really do believe that she loved him, and I do believe that he loved her in the capacity that he was capable of loving her. I don't think he was fully allowing himself to feel that love. I think he was really keeping it closed off and blocked, but I do think that he did in his own way. It's interesting, they're sitting on the pier and the lights all come on and everybody starts cheering, and she makes this comment about, like, you know, everybody cheers when the lights come on. It's kind of like they're excited for evening, and she's trying to talk about excitement in life and like what excites you, and he basically just starts talking about work again. Like, that's all he knows. That's his life. His purpose is his life, and he really doesn't really have the ability to stop and smell the roses. He doesn't have the ability to relax into feminine pleasure. It's just he keeps shutting that off in himself. It's one of the reasons he's so attracted to Miss Kenton, because she is that feminine energy. She is that part of him that he is so afraid to express, and he loves that part of her because it's the part of him that he's afraid to tap into. And there's a scene at the end where Mr. Stevens basically has to catch a bird in the manor, and then he has to let the bird go. And, you know, you watch the bird flying out the window, and that's obviously very symbolic, I'm sure. The masculine will always value freedom. I think you really do believe in the beginning that for Mr. Stevens, being devoid of feminine energy felt like freedom to him. It was like, okay, I have the freedom to just focus on my purpose, and I don't have the distractions, because that distraction is going to feel like a lack of freedom. Oftentimes, when the masculine is very focused on his purpose, any requirement from the feminine is going to feel like a loss of freedom, because he wants the freedom to focus on his purpose. As this goes on and he starts to feel love for someone, he starts to feel a connection to somebody, he starts to feel like that freedom, that dedication to your purpose, can then feel like a lack of freedom. So it's almost as if, you know, he had this freedom of not having the distractions, of not having any of that complicated situations with relationships, with love. He could just have the freedom to not worry about that and just solely focus on his purpose. But then once he started to experience love, connection, feminine energy, he started to really experience that in his life. The idea of completely dedicating his life to his purpose, to being in service of somebody else. I think the bird was symbolic of the fact that he started to realize that he wasn't actually free, that he was shutting off a part of his life that he really wanted, he really desired, but now he couldn't have that aspect of his life. He couldn't have a purpose of finding love, of having that part of his life, because his purpose was now the thing that was keeping him not free. Because the masculine will always devote himself to freedom. So whatever in his life comes up that makes him feel not free is going to feel like suffering. In the same way that with the feminine, she's always going to value love. So anything that feels like the loss of love is going to feel like suffering. So for Miss Kenton, losing Mr. Stevens really did feel like a loss of love for her, which she says in the beginning of her marriage, she was very miserable. Because the feminine will always long for the last man who has filled her up the most. That could be sexually, it could be just out of love, out of fulfillment of something. When she loses that, she will feel empty until another man can come along and fill that up again. So it took a husband who she wasn't really solely in love with, a daughter, and now a grandchild in order to fill her up with the love that she was feeling for Mr. Stevens, because she had so much love for him. Because again, they were so polarized, and again, it's an example of they're in a work situation, so they are professional, they keep things professional, but yet there's this polarity between the two of them, and the sexual energy doesn't ever come together, but it's there. It's very subtle, but it's there. I do think this film was a really great example of the extremes of masculine energy when it's completely devoid of feminine energy. And I think sometimes in these film examples, many of them are very extreme circumstances, but I think that they can help pick up on more subtle nuances or some of these big concepts, make them more relatable to your everyday life. So after you watch this video, I highly recommend that you watch this movie. See if you can pick up on some of the things that I mentioned. I'm going to include some mini film clip breakdowns on my TikTok, so be sure you follow me on TikTok so you can see some little breakdowns of some of the scenes that I mentioned in this video. If you have seen this movie or have any thoughts on anything that I talked about, be sure you let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below. If you have any other film suggestions, you can also leave those in the comment section below. I love to hear from you, and I love your suggestions. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please give it a big thumbs up, and be sure you subscribe to my channel. I have some new online courses available, so be sure you check those out in the description box below, along with links to all my social media accounts. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope you join me next time.